order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from California is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we are rightfully here today to honor the service and sacrifice of men and women in law enforcement, and also, I would just say, as the son of a police officer and a brother to 2 police officers, the family sacrifice, because what my mother and my brother's spouses endure is also a sacrifice. And the reason we hold police officers up in our community as some of the people most worthy of our respect is because we're aware of the sacrifice, that every day they walk the beat could be their last day. And we're reminded at the police officers' memorial in Washington, D.C. of 100 to 200 last days that so many men and women have suffered in our country. When I was a prosecutor in Oakland, California, one of the darkest days ever in the Bay Area was March 21, 2009. On that day, 4 police officers, Sergeant Mark Dunnican, Sergeant Daniel Sakai, and officers John Heggie and Irvin Romans were gunned down by a madman who had an assault rifle and killed all 4 of them in a matter of minutes. On July 22, 2015, Hayward Police Sergeant Scott Lunger in my district gunned down in our community. May 29, 2020, federal officer Dave Underwood, protecting a federal courthouse, gunned down on duty. As many of you probably know, if you've attended one of these yourself, attending a police officer funeral is one of the worst experiences anyone can see. To see the loss that the families have suffered, to see the men and women who have lost a colleague, but it also is one of the most uplifting experiences to see the camaraderie among men and women in law enforcement from not just all over the country, but from all over the world as they send their own to different police officer funerals throughout the country. So we rightfully honor them today. My amendment speaks to the leading cause of death outside of COVID-19 that law enforcement officers have suffered from. Gunshot wounds. 64 law enforcement officers were shot and killed while serving their communities in 2022. That same number in 2021. Law enforcement deaths by gun violence reflect a 21% increase over the historical average of firearms-related deaths between 2010 and 2020. We may all have different views on firearms and access to firearms and interpretation of the Second Amendment, but we cannot deny that it is firearms that are overwhelmingly stealing these police officers from their families and our communities. And my resolution, my amendment to this resolution, accurately reflects that. So while we honor their service, this amendment would seek to also be a reminder to all of us of what is killing them. It's a country that has unrestricted weaponry that too often falls in the hands of bad guys. And even when the good guys are armed, as we saw in Dallas nearly 10 years ago, when I believe it was 5 or 6 police officers were gunned down by someone with an assault rifle, that even when the good guys are armed, that a madman with a gun, a madman especially with an assault rifle, can take one or many of them from us. So my amendment, Mr. Chairman, would again honor the police, but also recognize what too often continues to take their lives. And I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
The amendment would introduce material beyond the scope and purpose of the bill before us and violates House Rule 6, Clause 7. In particular, I'd point to page 2, line 5, where It strikes local, expands the scope of the bill.
Gentleman, yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Does the sponsor of the amendment wish to be heard on the point of order?
Yeah, I would ask if the gentleman could just restate which line he's referring to?
It
The
would be-
gentleman from North Carolina? I'm sorry, Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany?
Yeah. Page 2, line 5.
So, as I understand it, Mr. Chairman, striking has no bearing on germaneness.
It does when it expands the scope of the underlying.
And I would, again, just ask, like, how does referencing how police officers are killed expand the scope of the underlying message? I mean, the whole purpose of this resolution is to honor the sacrifice of police officers, and the amendment articulates why they are dying.
The purpose of the underlying legislation is to honor the sacrifices specifically of local law enforcement, and this expands it to federal, and so on its face, then, it would be not germane.
And also, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for clarifying. I would also add that in the second paragraph, it does not reference local or federal, to Mr. Tiffany's point. It draws no distinction there.
Well, your amendment seeks to strike the word local, and so it on its face, clearly changes the scope.
I would offer to not strike the word local if you're willing to keep everything else. That's not. So if that's the germaneness issue, then I would offer to take that out.
We're looking for page 2.
Is this the one you're looking for?
I've suspended, I believe it's Mr. Swalwell's. Let's suspend the clock.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes. Gentleman's recognized.
um,
Well,
do I need a yield?
would you
Sure, I'd
yield?
yield, yes, of course.
Yeah, also, if you take a look at page 2, commits to passing common sense legislation to reduce gun violence, becomes a gun control bill, also not germane.
It's still your time, Mr. Swalwell.
Look, the point here is to recognize what is killing police officers. If the gentleman would stand down on his germaneness issue, I would happily delete that last line.
Yeah,
You're right.
the amendment is not germane, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman insists on his point of order, and I am prepared to
Sure,
rule.
and Mr. Chairman, just so I think, I want to make sure we're on the same page. If it's okay with the chairman, I would just ask for unanimous consent to delete the last line that the gentleman objects to, and also to delete what refers to local. And so we are voting on his concerns on germaneness.
The chair objects to the unanimous consent request.
Well, I'm just trying to save us time because I will just bring this forward with those deletions.
I'm sure that you will, but the gentleman's insisted on his point of order on the current amendment, and so I'm prepared to rule unless there's others who wish to seek to be recognized on this.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I would just suggest that if we want to go work on this offline after the committee hearing today, I'm sure we've got other amendments and stuff, be happy to do that.
All right. Reclaiming my time, I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'm about to rule. The gentleman's amendment does not satisfy the subject matter and fundamental purpose test, therefore is not germane and is out of order. Appeal the ruling is ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table.
And a motion to table the appeal is now in order, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Isa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany.
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Klein. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Nels. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes yes. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes yes. Ms. Hageman. Ms. Hageman votes yes. Mr. Moran. Ms. Lee. Mr. Hunt. Mr. Fry. Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr.
No.
Cohen.
No, I'm here.
Oh, Ms.
No.
Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Correa. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Neguse. Ms. McBath.
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Dean. Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Ross. Ms. Bush. Mr. Ivy.
No.
Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Isa votes yes. Mr. Fry votes aye. Ms. Sparts, you are not recorded. Ms. Sparts votes aye.
Any members, other members wish to vote? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 12 ayes and 11 noes.
The appeal is tabled.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H. Con Res 40 offered by Mr. Swalwell of California. Strike the sixth whereas clause.
Without objection, the
Mr.
amendment will be
Chairman, I
considered as read.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved, Mr. McClintock. And the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. And following up on the last amendment that I had, I hear Mr. Tiffany's concerns, and so I have written an amendment that addresses those by completely deleting everything in the resolved clause that I had in the prior amendment. So I'm just adding 4 what we would call whereases, laying out the statistics on gun violence as it relates to police officers with no color commentary or call of action that was included in the resolve clause. And again, if my colleagues in their last germaneous objection are being genuine, that they did not want us to vote because they had those procedural issues, well, those procedural issues have been addressed, and this plainly lays out the facts about police officers and what is killing them. And I would note that this is no different than what they have included in this resolution, by the way, where they talk about police officers who have, or they talk about the murder rate in America, they talk about the riots of 2020, and so this actually in more detail with statistics to back up the claims, lay out what is killing our police officers. And so with that, unless any of my colleagues wish to speak, I would also just want to thank our staff for being so quick on this to get this turned around, and Ms. Jackson Lee for yielding her amendment, which is next. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the point of order.
The gentleman withdraws his point of order. Does any other member wish to be recognized? If not, All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? No. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Isa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? No. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
No.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Aye. Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Sparts, you're not recorded. Ms. Sparts votes no.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Isa, you're not recorded. Mr. Isa votes no.
Anyone else hasn't been recorded?